Hello, my name is Debbie Terry and I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone joining us online for what's sure to be a fascinating reflection on the events of 50 years ago. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting? We honour their elders and their continuing cultural and spiritual connection to this land as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. I'd also like to acknowledge Fiona Taylor, Chair of the Brisbane Writers' Festival Board, our panel chair, the Honourable Matt Foley, and the other esteemed speakers who will contribute to this discussion. I am indebted to the Brisbane Writers' Festival organisers for rapidly shifting this event online after the event that was due to be staged at UQ had to be cancelled due to the COVID outbreak in Brisbane. The events of 1971 are a significant chapter in Queensland's history. So I'm glad we could reconvene online to hold this important discussion. The anti-apartheid protests of 1971, sparked by the touring, racially selected Springbok team, instigated a radical shift in political consciousness and attitudes towards race relations, social justice and civil liberties across Australia. It was also one of the most significant tests for UQ at a time when the university's credibility and legitimacy as an institution were at stake. Even before the Springbok protests, UQ was becoming a battleground for social and political change. A student movement demanding greater student and staff control of the university with autonomy from the state government was gaining momentum. There was heightened consciousness about women's liberation and racial equality in campus debate. And the Vietnam War was galvanising large numbers of students to protest, both on the streets and on campus. In one particularly ugly incident, a visit from the first secretary of the South Vietnamese embassy in Canberra prompted students to clash violently with police in what was dubbed by the press as a near riot. All this created many headaches for my predecessor, the then Vice-Chancellor, Sir Zelman Cowen, who described this time as, and I quote, the most unpleasant period of his life. Sir Zelman was himself a strong advocate for civil liberties. He accepted the premise that the university should serve as well as criticise society, and he declared early on in his tenure that he was open to criticism and dissent. But he also disliked chaos, destruction, and what he called mindless larrikinism. He feared that the protests against the Vietnamese ambassador were not in keeping with the traditions of free speech, academic freedom, and the right of individuals to come and go freely. Others disagreed. Protesting students camped out in tents in the Great Court, and by the end of 1970, Sir Zelman was pleading with staff and students for, and I again quote, a campus free from violence, ugly and intemperate language, and march and counter-march. He was not to get his way. The Springbok tour in the winter of 1971 was another flashpoint for student protests at our St Lucia campus. At one point, more than 2,000 students staged a sit-in of the Student Union complex. For them, if UQ was to retain its credibility, then courage, moral courage, needed to be valued by the university alongside freedom of speech and academic inquiry. Of course, their opposition to apartheid was occurring in a very hostile political environment in the Queensland that existed beyond our campus. The state government, led by Joh Bjelke-Petersen, was determined to prevent any form of dissent and certainly did not countenance the liberal notion of freedom of speech. The Premier declared a month-long state of emergency during the Springbok tour, and he gave police broad powers to suppress the protests. These opposing forces collided at the Tower Mill Motel on Wickham Terrace over several days in late July 1971. And as we'll hear through the first-person historical accounts of several of our panellists this afternoon, the protesters were met with unwarranted violence and brutality. So what is the legacy of these events? Writing just 14 years later in 1985, university historian Malcolm Thomas noted succinctly that, and I quote, "The Springboks left, apartheid survived, and so did the University of Queensland." He acknowledged, however, that this simplistic conclusion was insufficient to convey the essence of what the university experienced. Those who were present, he wrote, believed the university had been strengthened as a place of light and learning because through protest, debate and freedom of speech, and again I quote, complacency was shattered and purposes were re-examined. Today, with the benefit of 50 years of perspective, we can see that the campaign against the Springbok tour showed the power of mass protest movements to undermine racism and added to the growing global condemnation of the South African regime. No South African sporting team of any kind toured Australia again until apartheid collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Still, as the recent Black Lives Matter protests remind us, racial inequality, discrimination and persecution persist, including in our own society. So today, 50 years later, we are fortunate to have two panels to reflect on the lessons that can be learned from the events of 1971. The first will explore the protests, and the second will consider their aftermath and political legacy. Again, I'm delighted that UQ is hosting this important discussion, and it's now my great pleasure to turn proceedings over to the Honourable Matt Foley to introduce the first panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Dr. Valerie Coombs, Chair of the Quandamooka Ulu-Burrabi Registered Native Title Body Corporate. Mr. Anthony Abrahams, AM, lawyer and former rugby wallaby. Dr. Anne Richards, esteemed author and Griffith University academic. And Mr. Dan O'Neill, political activist, eminent scholar and orator. I respectfully invite Dr. Valerie Coombs of the Quandamooka people to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, please.
Oh. Well, thank you, Matt. When you were chatting before, you mentioned that you live at Fairfield and about the floods. Well, just so we know, when John Oxley came up the Brisbane River, the local people did sort of say, it's best you don't put anything here because it does tend to flood. It's a huge floodplain. And of course, no one took any notice, and how many dams and how many floods have we had? But I like to acknowledge all of the traditional owners in what we now know as Brisbane and Southeast Queensland, but we also have some people from the other side of Mullaney and down in Sydney. So we want to acknowledge all of the traditional owners in the areas that we all live and represent. So thank you, Matt, for this opportunity. And let's hope for an exciting Zoom recorded meeting.
Thank you very much indeed, Val. On the 1st of July, 50 years ago in 1971, an all-white South African rugby team, the Springboks, played against the Australian Wallabies at the Brisbane Exhibition Ground, despite significant public opposition to the repugnant apartheid nature of the South African regime and the racist exclusion of non-white South Africans from the Springbok team. A 2-metre chain wire barricade was erected to separate players from spectators. This panel discussion on political football is convened by the Brisbane Writers' Festival with the assistance of the University of Queensland to discuss those events of 1971. I've been asked to chair this session today to focus principally on what happened 50 years ago. My name is Matt Foley. I practice as a barrister. I was employed as a social worker with the Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders Legal Service here in Brisbane in the 1970s. I served as Attorney General and Arts Minister in the Goss and Beattie governments of Queensland. The next session, to be chaired by Professor Julianne Schultz, will focus on the legacies of the anti-apartheid protests and their short and long-term impacts in Queensland and beyond. I respectfully thank Ms. Sarah Runcie of the Brisbane Writers' Festival and Professor Deborah Terry, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland, for making this event possible. These panel discussions were due to be held before a live audience on the 31st of July. They had to be postponed because of a lockdown arising from the COVID pandemic and are now being conducted by Zoom. 1971 was a time both in South Africa and Australia when structural racism was being challenged. This was eloquently expressed by the great Stradbroke Island poet Oodgeroo Noonuccal, also known as Kath Walker, in her poem, All One Race. And I quote, "Black, white or brown race, yellow race or red, from the torrid equator to the ice fields spread. Messieurs et seigneurs, lubras and fraus, all one family, so why family rows? We're not interested in their igloos. They're not mad about our kangaroos. I'm international, never mind place. I'm for humanity, all one race," unquote. A little over 2 weeks before the infamous 1971 rugby match against the Springboks in Brisbane, ironically enough, on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, a racist, oppressive Bjelke-Petersen government of Queensland had declared a state of emergency for a month under the State Transport Act, used principally for natural disasters. The Bjelke-Petersen government then mobilised hundreds of police from throughout the state to come to Brisbane to suppress protesters. On Thursday, July the 22nd, 1971, outside the Tower Mill Hotel at Wickham Terrace in Brisbane, an infamous police charge against demonstrators took place, resulting in many arrests and allegations of police brutality. We are fortunate indeed today to have such a distinguished and, may I say, formidable panel of speakers to inform us of the stirring events of half a century ago. I shall invite each of our panellists in turn, introduce them and ask them to speak for up to 10 minutes each. After the 4 speakers have concluded their initial presentations, there will be opportunity for questions and discussion. I turn now to the first of our speakers, Dr. Valerie Coombs, who belongs to the Quandamooka people. She is a director on Indigenous Business Australia, Aboriginal Hostels Limited and TAFE Queensland. Valerie was formerly the CEO of Queensland South Native Title Services and served as a member of the National Native Title Tribunal. Valerie will address us today on this topic generally, including national and international aspects of the events of 1971. Thank you very much for coming to join us, Valerie.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you referring to Oodgeroo or only Kath Walker. Well, she's actually my godmother. If you can have a godmother in the Communist Party, which I did. So I bow my head and realise how fortunate I am to have had her as a godmother and Dennis as a first cousin. So there we go. I was living in a country town in North Queensland, and we didn't get TV till I turned 15, and we only had the ABC. So we made sure that we got interesting stories in the build-up of the Springboks. My father was always politically aware, explained many issues in terms of South Africa. But I also studied South African history at university because I was always interested in what was going on. So I just want to give a quick overview from an Aboriginal perspective in terms of this white South African business. But I split it into international, national and state levels just to break it up. So bear with me. As most of us would know, that in the first 15 years after World War II, over 600 million people throughout the world were decolonised. So we saw a big push throughout the world, an anti-racism push. And the newly established and newly shaped UN replaced the former League of Nations. And post-World War II, communications had increased. Decolonisation, as we mentioned, the world anti-racism push existed, and that was affecting everybody right here in Queensland as well. The newly formed UN members fully understood the impact of colonisation, imperialism, with settler colonialism particularly troublesome, because Australia's colonialism, a particular type of colonisation where people come, they reduce the local people to a minority and then don't go home. That's us, a settler colony. The world knew about South Africa and the world knew about Queensland. The World Council of Churches and various other international organisations were in regular contact with Aboriginal groups, including the Federated Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, FCATSI, that Arnie Kath was a member of, and also the National Tribal Council, amongst other organisations. So on a national level, as we know, Australia federated in 1901, basically did not cater for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. And some people argue that there was a belief that we were all going to die out. It was definitely hard for the federal government to get the states to agree, Queensland being one of the last, of course. They divided the responsibilities between states and the Commonwealth, and the feds got the tax and trade, defence, and the states got land, Aboriginal people, health, education, housing, police, prisons and courts, which is really interesting. The Commonwealth just insisted it could not move on the state's treatment of Aboriginal people because of the Constitution. The lobby to the UN about the referendum and the need for change to the Constitution included churches, trades union, again for FCATSI, Jessie Street, the UN and other international connections was strong. The treatment of conditions of Aboriginal people was highlighted right throughout the international level. At a time when the federal government was keen to have UN conventions ratified, Australia wanted to take its place as a serious international entity. The UN refused to ratify the conventions until Australia had done three things. One was to remove all racist legislation from Australian statutes. Two, introduce anti-discrimination legislation. And three, ensure that those colonised have access to lands, i.e. land rights. The difficulty for that was difficult for the federal government to implement, but it held the 1960 referendum and there were no longer any more excuses. So at the state and local levels, Queensland had introduced legislation dealing with Aboriginal people dating back to 1897, the Aboriginal Protection Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. They knew it was unjust, and they basically said to deal with them, meaning Aboriginal people, effectually, in accordance with any system of justice, would practically have meant the stopping of all settlement until the future of the Aboriginals was definitely arranged. So they all knew everything they were doing was unjust, but they had to proceed regardless. So the draconian tactics in 1897, they knew it was unjust, of course, but up until the 1970s in Queensland, Aboriginal people were unable to grow vegetables or make a living from any means other than working for officials on reserves. They had their wages confiscated to pay for their incarceration on government reserves. They were jailed for committing adultery, being idle or entering a park for a way other than the gate designed for that purpose. There were strict controls over movements of and property of Aboriginal people. Pressure on Australia in the 1968 5 Act attempt at addressing racism, the confiscation of wages, controls continued and attempts were made to justify that. The 1965 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs Act saw officials within the Department of Native Affairs lose the ability to apprehend any Aboriginal person and send them to a reserve indefinitely. So they lost that right in 1965. And the then acting Premier did say that if you don't have the Department of Native Affairs under control, you'll have to resort to the criminal justice system, which is exactly what started to happen. In 1971, again, Queensland changed its legislation and the 1971 Aborigines Act was introduced, and we saw then, and that was introduced in December 1971. So obviously the Queensland government was under pressure, and under pressure from the Commonwealth, unprecedented pressure. And the Queensland government lost the ability to keep Aboriginal people on reserves against their will. So there were two things that happened around about that time. Was the Station Hands Award, where pastoralists had to pay Aboriginal workers on pastoral properties award wages, and so they just decided not to employ them anymore. And also Aboriginal people were allowed to leave reserves at the end of 1971, early 1972. So there was a mass influx of Aboriginal people from pastoral properties and reserves into Queensland towns and cities, mostly for the first time in colonial history. Now, some of the comparisons of what happened in other colonies like South Africa, they had a flawed constitution. I think the South African constitution was drafted probably about 7 or 8 years after the Australian one. The fear of urbanisation of those colonised. There was a definite fear when people actually move into the areas where the colonisers reside. African people, some places were allowed to vote, but not allowed to stand for election. Queensland removed restrictions on Aboriginal people's voting. So they removed the restrictions that stopped Aboriginal people from being allowed to vote. But there were so many complaints before the election that all the people who had registered to vote in Queensland at 1965, when they changed the legislation, they were disqualified from voting because of the complaints from people in high areas where Aboriginal people were enrolled. So it seems that similarly to South Africa, people are fearful when they're outnumbered, and they're fearful when they feel outnumbered. They were never outnumbered to the, we were never outnumbered to the, they were never outnumbered to the extent they were in South Africa. 1948, with the apartheid regime was introduced, post-World War II decolonisation movement that swept across Africa. So you can see they would have been absolutely worried, and also that South Africa was going from a fully agricultural economy to mining and also manufacturing. So they needed the cheap labour, which meant you needed more people coming into the urban areas, which really got people upset. So like in Queensland, the rapid influx of Aboriginal people off reserves and pastoral properties in the Queensland towns and cities created a lot of cause for concern. And Matt will remember the days when the University of Queensland did a survey into poverty in Brisbane in 1974, led by Regine Hirschfeld. And they interviewed a whole lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people residing in Brisbane at that time.
I worked on that under the supervision of Regine, yeah.
Yep, and 80% of the people interviewed were not born in Brisbane. So that's how many people had moved to Brisbane, and that was just Brisbane, because you've got Rockhampton, Cairns, Townsville, places like that. So the rapid influx and urbanisation, the criminal justice system being used to control people, are overrepresented in the representation in the criminal justice system. But of course, you had to balance it up with the colonisers' need for cheap labour. But at no time were the people in South Africa or Aboriginal people ever seen as landholders or landowners. If anything, we were a nuisance, but if they were able to exploit us as cheap forms of labour, then we were tolerated. So, and of course, the same thing that happened here was the fear of miscegenation. Queensland was absolutely paranoid about mixed races and white people not being pure anymore. But like South Africa, the Commonwealth was pressured from international expectations and the UN scrutiny over the treatment and condition of those colonised, so created a lot of uncertainty. So I'll leave it there. That's a quick look.
Thank you very much indeed, Val. That certainly gives us a very strong perspective on apartheid overseas and apartheid and racism here.
Yeah.
Including your observation about the that at this time in 1971, in July, August, Aboriginal people on reserves still didn't have the right to just leave the reserves, not until after subsequent legislation. And in that regard, it was a terrible situation. I'll turn now to our next speaker, Anthony Abrahams. Played in the Australian rugby team between 1967 and 1969. After deepening his knowledge of apartheid South Africa during the 3-month Wallaby rugby tour of 1969, where he attracted the attention of the South African authorities for the depth of his inquiry, he declared his opposition to the continuation of sporting ties between Australia and South Africa. Coming directly after the end of the tour, his leading letter in the Australian press, the Sydney Morning Herald, I think, played a significant role in adding impetus to the incipient rumbles about Australia's ties with apartheid sport in South Africa. And if I might make an aside, at some stage it'd be interesting to see the power of the written word in this political context, but also in the context of the Brisbane Writers' Festival and the importance of writing to persuade. After authoring further letters and being quoted in numerous press statements reinforcing his opposition, Anthony returned to Australia in 1971 to spearhead a stand by 7 Wallabies, himself, Jim Boyce, Paul Darvanisa, James Roxburgh, Terry Foreman, the late Barry McDonald and the late Bruce Taft, in support of the campaign to ban the South African rugby and cricket tours of that year. Anthony's campaign tour took in all Australian mainland states and ultimately contributed, with the support of the other 6 Wallabies, to the cancellation of the South African cricket tour by the Sir Don Bradman-led Australian Cricket Board in mid-1971. The stand of the 7 Wallabies took place alongside the general Stop the Tours campaign. The group of 7 Wallabies have ever since been recognised for their stand. Anthony Abrahams' principal role in the stand was mentioned in the background biography to his recent award of an AM. I'd be grateful, Anthony, if you could give us some insight into what led you to have these strong views to propel you into your opposition to apartheid and the subsequent actions that you took in 1969 and 1971 on the rugby front.
Well, thanks very much, Matt. I can't speak to the deeper subterranean background issues to why I was slightly in advance of my teammates on this issue, but certainly meeting a girl at the American Embassy whose father had been an ambassador to the United States and had been demoted during the McCarthy period, and who was a Russian expert. Chip Boland was his name, and her name was Celestine Boland. She became a journalist for the New York Times, and she was a guest at the embassy that night, and she spoke with me about the movements that were taking place in the United States, which were in advance of ours. Then Kent State University had taken place, where there was people were killed during a demonstration, and there were groups organising around the issue of race. And so my view that politics and sport didn't mix was challenged, and it became more and more clear before the tour began that I had a real issue as the question of politics and sport actually mixing crystallized in my mind. And so I spoke to a group of 7 people, much older than myself in the legal profession, plus Charles Perkins and an exiled South African called John Brink. 5 of them advised me to go and see for myself, because they were clear-sighted about the ineffectual nature of my making a stand on my own before the tour took place. And Brink changed his mind in later and wrote to me saying that I'd made the right decision. And I never saw Charles Perkins again face to face, so I don't know whether he changed his mind as well. I'd like to think he would, because instead of partying with the team, I made a conscious choice to go out and meet with political entities whilst in South Africa, honed my views, and was able to speak to the issues with quite a lot more detail and clarity, and with the credibility of having been there when I finally made the stand, if you like to call it that, through writing the letter that you mentioned, Matt, and which...
cracker of a letter, if I might say so, at the risk of interrupting you. I reread it the other day, and it was beautifully expressed, succinctly and powerfully, if I might respectfully say so.
Thank you. But it had the effect of sort of starting a horse race with a hand grenade, really. So over the next 2 years, between 1969 and 71,
Yeah,
the other 6 wallabies joined me, and we were a group which gave us much greater strength.
yes.
And so in South Africa, of course, we came up against petty apartheid, as they call it, on a day-to-day basis. The separate seat benches, the treatment of the blacks, which was unapologisingly horrific. And it became clear to the whole of the team, actually, what we were living. For the first time in our lives, we were living in a repressive society where political issues arose on a day-to-day basis. Most of the team chose not to ignore that, but not to do anything about it. I found it too immediate to turn my back on it. I think that's probably enough for the moment. I'll just say one thing to Val. I don't think there was sufficient combination with the Australian Aboriginal issues during the stand on apartheid. However, there was more than one thought, or one thinks. There was a crossover, and I think that in the end, that group of young Indigenous of activists took a certain amount of encouragement from the reaction of the Australian community on the South African issue to do things like set up the tent embassy on Parliament House lawn, and to go from there to coalesce into a more militant young Indigenous movement. And so in the end, I think that the two movements had quite a lot in common.
I'd be very interested in your views on the way rugby has changed symbolically and politically in South Africa. And let me preface my remarks by an anecdote, if I may. Back in December of 2011, just under 10 years ago, I visited Cape Town and spent a day visiting Nelson Mandela's former prison cell on Robben Island off the coast, where he served a lengthy period of imprisonment. A few days later, I went to the Nelson Mandela Stadium at Port Elizabeth to watch my son play in the Rugby Sevens for Australia against South Africa and other nations of the world. And what struck me was that when the mixed race, black, white, so on, players from South Africa came on, everyone in the crowd was behind them, yelling, including all the sort of white bother boys with their boots and what have you. And I gained the impression that Mandela had turned around the whole symbolism of rugby in South Africa. Instead of being an elite white supremacist symbol, to being something in which black, white and other peoples could feel some sense of national unity. Has that been your impression, or?
Yeah, that's not an impression. That's a fact. Mandela, in a brilliant political gesture, appeared on in the stadium for the World Cup final of 1995, I think it was, wearing the number 6 jersey the Springboks that Francois Pienaar had given him. It was a bingo moment, a moment of absolute clarity in Mandela's mind. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so he, instead of setting up antipathy to a team that was capable of uniting the nation behind it, he did the reverse. And we saw what that did to the nation when they won the 1965 World Cup. And I must say that it gives all of us, well, initially 7 Wallabies, huge pleasure when we see some of these brilliant Black African players being really the fundamental players very often of the Springboks. It's a great pleasure to see.
Being there at Port Elizabeth and seeing a whole group of Black South African players run on, including the famous Cecil Africa, who was a brilliant rugby sevens player. But when you mentioned the symbolic significance of the number 6 jersey, I just realised behind me on the wall is my son's jersey from the number 6 jersey, incidentally, in the rugby sevens from the 2013 Rugby Sevens World Cup in Moscow. But yeah, and I think that film Invictus celebrated that. Can I just ask this? It must have been a pretty difficult task, was it, to mobilise 6 other Wallabies, given the relatively conservative nature of the background, private schools and so on, of most people playing rugby at that stage?
Not only wasn't it, was it not difficult, I had nothing to do with it in a sense. I did apply gentle pressure to those that were on the tour to come and meet the women of the Black Sash and to accompany me to some meetings. And when they didn't really want to do that, that was fine. But they came back retaining all the stuff that had alienated most of the team. And when Jeffrey Robinson did an interview with them for Blackacre, the law school magazine, which was bought by the Australian, and he asked them at the end of that 2-page spread whether they'd be willing to play against South Africa again, he confronted them with the obvious fact that they just actually fabricated a rope for their own necks, if you like. They had to say no. I'm not saying that they didn't want to say no, but they publicly in that interview took that position, and then we were 7.
Let me ask you one quick question, and then we'll move on to Anne. You've had a strong commitment to human rights and the rule of law. You're a lawyer. You've practiced in France. You're a partner in an international law firm. And when you observed the police and government responses in 1971 to the Springbok tour here in Australia, what impression did you form about the state of the rule of law in Australia at that time?
Well, this is a Brisbane Writers' Festival, so let's confine it to Queensland. And it was a deep shock when I spoke. I went and stayed with Tom Burns, who was the Federal Secretary of the Labor Party at the time, if I remember rightly. And Sir Kai Holland was with me, who was then Rhodesian, a Rhodesian African who was married to an Australian, and we campaigned together. It reminds me of T.E. Lawrence, the description of T.E. Lawrence in the satire Beyond the Fringe, where they said that with flowing white robes and a golden scimitar swinging by his side, he hoped to pass unnoticed through the streets of London. And Sakai, with golden and green coloured turbans and flowing African robes, hoped to pass unnoticed through the Roma Street Forum in the centre of Brisbane. And so we campaigned together. We were the subject of the object of really nasty epithets for both of us, and we got the impression that Joh Bjelke-Petersen had done a great job in dividing Queensland society.
I'll be interested to hear Dan's views on that in a few minutes. Thank you very much indeed, Anthony, and thank you for that terrific contribution that you made between 69 and 71 in connection with that debate about the role of politics in sport. Let me turn now to Dr. Anne Richards. She teaches at Griffith University. Her memoir, A Book of Doors, which I thoroughly recommend, based on the student radical movement at the University of Queensland in the late 1960s and 1970s, was released in 2020. Her awards include a Griffith Review Fellowship in 2018 and an ARC postdoctoral fellowship for her work on the Australian publishing industry. She co-edited and contributed to Making Books, Contemporary Australian Publishing, and I'll invite Anne to speak with us and hopefully to read us some passages from her book, please. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks to Valerie and Anthony. I'm looking forward to Dan speaking too. The Queensland Anti-Apartheid Protests were one part of a national campaign that brought together the unions, seasoned and young protesters, alongside Indigenous activists. Every state has its own story, and these stories are full of stirring testimonies of courage and also of violence, because there were violent demonstrations in every state. My role here is to personalise the Queensland history. Now, I was one person who became an activist listening at the forums at UQ, where Dan O'Neill was a powerful voice, one of many speakers debating the horrors of the Vietnam War and a wide range of political, social and educational issues. It was a really engaged campus at that stage. First though, I wanted to lay out what grabbed my attention about Black rights when I was very young. This is a passage from my book, A Book of Doors, which was published by And Also Books last year. Why my search for alternative truth started early, at an early age. When I was very young, a part of my world went missing. The beautiful Aboriginal girl from Cherbourg who did housework for my mother, who had 8 children, Sandra disappeared in the night. She was my first hero, a storyteller from a different world. Sometimes I'd convince Mum that I was sick so I could stay home from school and hang out with Sandra. She taught me how to dance. We'd dance across the wide kitchen floor, laughing and a bit embarrassed because I felt so clumsy and she was so good. When she left, I found a short note saying, "Sorry, but I have to go home with my sister." I cried when I found it. I kept writing to her, Sandra Malone, Cherbourg, but never got a letter back, never knew if she received my letters. They were probably intercepted by authorities. I wanted to find her, but I didn't know where Cherbourg was. I couldn't find it on a map. Mum tried to explain that it was complicated. It was the first time I didn't believe her. So that's probably why I was already paying attention when Martin Luther King and the freedom rides in the US were reported in the news during the 60s. I watched the civil rights protests and listened to King's speeches. The words seared into my space. In Australia too, in 1965, Charles Perkins and others were staging freedom rides through New South Wales, challenging apartheid in country towns, swimming pools, bars and theatres, causing trouble. These courageous acts were hidden in small columns in the local papers, but I found and read them. Many of my friends were searching for different answers to questions that had never been asked by the youth of this unsure nation. The Springbok tour was an opportunity to embed an anti-racist Black rights dialogue into the political conversation of Australia. Most Australians were ignorant of apartheid and accepted that sport and politics should be kept in separate compartments like black, yellow and white South Africans or black and white Australians. A major learning event for me was when former Wallaby Anthony Abrahams and Zimbabwean black activist Sekai Holland appeared as key speakers in the UQ main refectory. So I thank Anthony for that personally. Premier Joh's actions declaring a state of emergency and his law and order campaign led to ongoing brutality in the streets of Brisbane. And this is my story of one protest against the Springboks at the Tower Mill on the 31st of July, 1971, 50 years ago. It was a unique coming together that night. Leadership from Aboriginal elders and black activists joined with white protesters in all their varied manifestations. It was very diverse. It was not an unruly mob. The mood was solemn and serious, not wild and riotous. It was a vigil, not a march, and we were singing quite gently, I thought. But everyone knew there were always consequences for posing a strong challenge to authority, particularly Queensland authority. Several of the Springboks came out on the balcony yelling and making angry gestures. Baited like angry swordfish, the footballers leaned over their balconies yelling, "What's it? What's it?" which basically means fuck off, fuck off. The crowd chanted back, "Go home, racists, Springboks go home," or sometimes, "Welcome home, racists," to emphasise the systemic violent racism in our own home state. My voice mixed with 1,000 people on that sidewalk adding, "Paint them black and send them back." Another busload of cops arrived. As they disembarked, the verbal gesturing intensified with country cops yelling back, "Paint them red and shoot them dead." This slogan exchange emphasised the deep-rooted division across that Wickham Terrace road. The air grew thick with clashing words and toxicity. A message spread that the police claimed a rock was thrown from the crowd, breaking a window on a third-floor unit of the Tower Mill. What the fuck came from the activists? No one's done anything. We looked around in disbelief at the tall motel, people judging angles and arcs. That's impossible. Another theory was that the police kicked it in with their own black boots. This is a setup. We all agreed this is not good. This was the cue for the cops to have their way. Helmeted lines advanced, shoulders aligned. They started running and the line broke up into thick-set shapes. They speared into the protesters, punching and shoving the crowd over the low curved stone wall, then down into the steep slopes of the unlit Wickham Park. This is it, I thought, calling to my friends who were standing next to the mill. We headed down Wickham Terrace away from the charge, but the police had circled below us and were already moving up the hill. Country cops know all about herding, and we were being shoveled into Violence Central, tripping over each other as we were squashed and then pushed over the wall back into the park. Trying to stay together, we ran across the grass ground through the tall black trees. These cops were big, badged with numbers removed, batons out under the cover of dark. It was fierce, the air pierced with sounds of people falling, of scuffles and screams. Running for life through this chaos, I looked across the moving shadows and huddled shapes, saw raised arms and heard the muffled cries. It seemed the police had been lying in wait behind those trees. It was all planned. Anyone who fell over would be easy prey. "Don't go there, guys," I yelled, "this way, down the steep slopes." Suddenly grateful for big family living where I'd always had an escape plan, and always still do, I knew that moving crossways like a crab was an effective move. Threading through the trees and dodging other escapees was tricky though. The police kept bursting through the darkness, waiting to pounce. As we approached the steep cliff face, there weren't many choices. Better to be jumped than be pushed, I thought. So I jumped, more a stumbling fall than a controlled leap. I had no control at all, really. But our group landed on that lighted path about 10 feet below, relatively unscathed. Just before I jumped, I saw a cluster of shadows crash over the wall to the north of us, dark shapes above them, then moving back into the park. Then a girl's screams froze the night. Help! Somebody help, she yelled. And that's a photo of the police and my friends with Luke Swan.
Photos in your book are terrific. They're very evocative. And
Thank you. Luke was thrown over the cliff and bashed up and broke his leg, landed in hospital.
For the benefit of those who may watch this video in future, those passages come from page 149 to 152 of Anne's book, and give us a very graphic account of the blood and thunder that was in the air that night up at the Tower Mill.
Can I just finish with one thing?
Yes, of course.
The following day after that, 4,000 students voted to strike until the team left Australia. And at that time, there were only 8,000 full-time students and 4,000 part-time students on campus, which shows the level of participation that had been gathered across that university and to campaign against these protests. A poem I wrote about the Tower Mill charge ended. It was night, it is history, the third witness. And this week, 50 years later, we are witnessing the third witnessing of this important University of Queensland, this state and national history. So.
Yes. Thank you very much, Anne. And hopefully Dan may be able to shed some light on the events of the strike at university and so on. Let me introduce Dan. I'll start by way of a passage from Anne's book at page 17, talking of the forum at Queensland Uni, where in the last paragraph of that page, Anne writes, a typical big crowd Wednesday forum would have at least 6 speakers. Since the radicals did most of the organising, they often did most of the talking. But it was an open mic and anything could happen. Lecturer Dan O'Neill unravelled webs of deceit and stupidity according to his own worldview. A seductive speaker, his every phrase dripped with passion. I remember Dan speaking back in 68, 69, my first 2 years at university, and I've never heard greater oratory. It was very difficult come from a conservative Catholic school to have these worldviews presented in such a powerful and analytic way. Dan is a political activist and University of Queensland lecturer, is a powerful spokesperson and campaigner against war, racism, political and social injustice. He was a prominent leader of the anti-Vietnam War movement and the protests against apartheid and the Springbok rugby tour, as well as the Right to March rallies during the Bjelke-Petersen era in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Dan remains a highly respected public intellectual and articulate spokesperson for progressive social and political causes. So thank you, Dan, for joining us, and perhaps you can tell us about some of your own experiences in 1971, both at the university and directly in the protests against the Springboks.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. My first memory of involvement in the Springbok protests involves Anthony, actually. I remember turning up in the refectory at the University of Queensland, which was at that stage still the big refectory, that's been subsequently divided. It was on a Friday afternoon. In fact, it was exactly 2 months before the declaration of the state of emergency. It was Friday the 14th of May, and I saw these two people, one of whom was the rather exotically, from my point of view, dressed Sekai Holland that Anthony's just reminded us of, and the other was Anthony. And it's funny how details stick in your memory out of the past. It's like you never remember huge blocks of the past. But I remember Anthony saying that the way to remember this fairly unfamiliar word to most of us was if you thought of it in two parts: apart, hate. So it was hating people who were apart. Now, that was one event which introduced us to the possibility that there'd be these national protests, which subsequently, of course, occurred. Then, in the month of June, there were various events, particularly at the University of Queensland. I remember a number of radical students interrupted a psychology lecture, and there were eventually 12 disciplinary charges arising out of that. There was the third moratorium. There was a very popular and aggressive theatrical event called On Stage Vietnam. And then on Wednesday, the 14th of July, you got this declaration of a state of emergency for 1 month. And Petersen told the police union that cops wouldn't be penalised for any action that they took to suppress demonstrators. And this, of course, was after demonstrations that occurred in Perth and Adelaide and Melbourne and Sydney. So it was like this snake coiling around from the west to the east of Australia, gradually coming up, so that people were anticipating this with some apprehension. But I think the declaration of that ridiculous state of emergency actually changed the nature of the protest. Like in previous protests, there'd been such events as the attempt to stop the actual games from occurring, like people actually trying to saw the goalposts in half and so on. Now, it became dramatically apparent in Queensland, given barbed wire, given cohorts of police in their hundreds being brought in from every country region in Queensland, that we weren't going to stop any matches. And so on the night of the Tower Mill, which has just been dramatically redescribed by Anne, after the police assault, which is what it effectively was, and in retrospect, we can see that the sort of stuff that only became apparent after the inquiry into police corruption occurred, we can see that there was division within the police ranks, very radical division between the people who would have supported people like Terry Lewis and the people who supported the almost officially unsupported commissioner, the reforming commissioner, Ray Ritrod. I think that was the reason why it was possible for the police to act outside their ambit and pull off that that charge. Anyway, those of us who'd been involved in that, some of us went back to the house that I lived in at the time, which was a kind of a radical hangout, 22 Chanel Drive, St. Lucia. Ooh. And we spent the night thinking, well, what the hell are we going to do now? And we wrote a pamphlet suggesting an alternative strategy to oppose the Springbok tour. And we took it out to the university, and the following day, after having distributed this pamphlet, there was a meeting in the refectory, and the strategy we'd come up with was this. We were going to try to pull the university out on strike. We were then going to send emissaries down to all the other Australian universities to try to get all the Australian universities to go on strike. And if we pulled that off, we wanted to ask the ACTU to declare a general strike in Australia. So I think the effect of Bjelke-Petersen's calling a state of emergency interacted dialectically, as it were, with probably what was the most radical campus in Australia at that time, with the possible exception of Monash, which from my point of view was mainly dominated by fairly mad Maoists. But in the University of Queensland, in the matrix of a very strong civil liberties movement, which had taken the whole university into Roma Street, either marching or walking along the footpath, watching it, several thousands of students. There was a very active radical movement of a quite comprehensive and intelligent kind that also included radical critique of the university as a functioning part of the society. There was a book called Up the Right Channels, produced about a year before this state of emergency, making a comprehensive attack on the nature of the university, written by 100 staff and students, and criticising not only the whole university, but just about every individual department. So that was the context in which people were now engaging after about 3 years of activity in a big radical minority. That was the context in which the state of emergency made it impossible to do the kind of protests that had been going on in the rest of Australia. We did send emissaries to nearly all the other universities. Unfortunately, the second and third stages of our strategy couldn't be fulfilled. But the university strike did go on for about 2 weeks. It wasn't pulled off until, from memory, it would have been August the 15th, I think, and there was a high tea ceremony to declare that the strike was over, and somebody played the last post on a trumpet and so on. So that was, I think, one significance of the Springbok tour in Brisbane. But another equally important significance, I think, was that we'd become aware of a speech by Paul Coe, one of the black radicals in Sydney, excoriating a crowd for being interested in opposing apartheid in South Africa, but he wanted to know, what's your attitude to endemic racism in Australia? Well, not long after that, Paul Coe and his comrade Gary Foley came up to the University of Queensland, and there was a meeting between them and young black radicals on the campus. And so that the confrontation with Australian racism was, I think, part of our impulse in engaging in the anti-Springbok things. And subsequent to the academic year that year, we held a really big for the first time, a really big conference on Australian racism at the University of Queensland over that summer break.
Could I just ask you, Dan, at the risk of interrupting you, that seems to me a pretty fundamental turning point in the political awareness of radical left in Australia. I'd be interested in your assessment of the lasting effect of that, and I might, after, if you wish to answer that, ask Valerie whether, from the point of view of the Aboriginal community, that represented some turning point in political awareness in Australia.
Yeah, being aware that we've probably only haven't got too much time, and I'd like to hear Val on this.
Well, I'll give Dan a chance because I've interrupted him to speak first, and then I'll invite Val to say what she wishes.
Yeah, it'd probably be more worthwhile to hear Val on this, I think. But from my point of view, that was one main consequence of the Springbok tour. I remember, you know, we were quite familiar with the whole of the Watson family. You know, Lenny and Sam and so on, and Pastor Don Brady. And I think that just became a feature of radical organising in Brisbane from that time on.
Yes, thank you, Dan. Valerie, your thoughts on the significance of the 1971, and was it a turning point in terms of political awareness?
I think the communication associated with the demonstrations was certainly a turning point for a lot of people.
Right.
I think capturing people's objections to the apartheid regime was basically something that marked a transition in status, really, of Queensland's younger people and their objections to the apartheid regime. I think everybody got a shock at the numbers of people that turned out for those demonstrations. But I'm interested in Paul Coe's comment that where were all the people? But there were lots of objections. I think the world was at that time becoming a much smaller place. As I mentioned earlier, the world anti-racism push seemed to have filtered down into Australia, and it did filter down through the through sport. I don't think Australia was ready for such radicalism. But having said that, the demonstrations certainly seem to have made Australia a much more mature nation, and people did start to ask about its own regime in Queensland.
I'm mindful that we are a little bit short of time now, and I'll invite each of you to make any, 1 minute final observations if you wish to. Sorry, I haven't given you a heads up on that. Anthony, is there anything you wish to add at this stage?
Well, I'll pass on my time, except to say to Val that to go back to my mention of the tent embassy on Parliament House law, and I think that was a high-profile event that lasted quite a long time, and I think fascinated a lot of Australia. And so I think that was, I like to claim that was a direct outcome of the South African opposition.
Okay. All right. Anne, I wonder if you've got any closing comment that you'd like to make?
Yeah, I just think that the four views and perspectives, including and adding in your own stories, Matt, has opened up a really good area for discussion, and which will lead very well. And I'm looking forward to the next panel on the legacy of this time, because it was certainly a momentous time, and I do think it changed so many mindsets and brought together a lot of people into strong alliances to take action to start helping our own First Nation people.
Thank you, Anne. And
or for
Anne?
them to help support them, not that
Yes.
we lead it, but they lead it.
Yes. Thank you, Anne. Dan, do you have any final observations that you wish to make?
Yeah, no, well, not really, except one thing, maybe a rather ideological kind. In a way, you could look at this as a classic liberal issue, but it's paradoxical that the people who took the lead on opposing the Springbok tour in Australia at that time were all rather more radical than classic liberalism. I mean, if you think of Zelman Cowen, for example, as a classic liberal, Zelman Cowen in the big meeting in the Great Court, where there was something like 5,000 or 6,000 staff and students, he opposed the strike. The strike was overwhelmingly endorsed by at least 80% of that crowd. And I think it wouldn't have happened either here or in the other states if it hadn't been led by what amounted to the new left at that time.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anthony. And thank you, Val. I'll conclude with another quote from Oodgeroo Knuckle, also known as Kath Walker, because listening to the terrible experiences people had to go through in 1971, 50 years ago, and to see hopefully the progress that's been made since then, I'm put in mind of what that poem called Song of Hope by Oodgeroo Knuckle, where she summed it up in this way: to our fathers' fathers, the pain, the sorrow, to our children's children, the glad tomorrow. Let me also thank Sarah Runcie, Melissa and Emily and the other Brisbane Writers Festival staff who have made this possible, hopefully so that we can learn from our past and make the present and the future better. So thank you all, and I think it's time to sign off.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. See you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.